Hey guys, this is Tech Howdy. I welcome you to another video tutorial. In this video tutorial series where we're building a CMS application using Angular 10 and ASP.NET Core 3. In the last video tutorial, we learned how to implement logging in our application using Serilog logging library. If you haven't watched that video tutorial, I recommend you to go ahead and watch it because we will be using that library to print logs in our log file and console. Since we are building some components going further, we need to debug errors and we need logs. So if you haven't watched that video, go ahead, watch that video, implement logging in your project, and then start following this video tutorial. In this video tutorial, what are we going to learn? We are going to learn how to create a database using EntityFrameworkCore. Now, if you're not familiar with EntityFrameworkCore, please go ahead and read information on that from Microsoft's official website, which for the link I will provide it in the video description. You can find the link in the video description. So EntityFrameworkCore, we can build websites using different methodology with code first or with database first. So in our case, we are using code first, where we will be building the classes that are required, and then we will convert those classes into our database table. So if you are not familiar with what I am talking about, as I told you, read the documentation. You need to have some working knowledge of EntityFrameworkCore. But if you don't, you can still follow along this video tutorial. I will try my best to explain in detail and in step by step how we are creating the database. And if you still don't follow, I recommend you to at least go ahead and read this documentation. So I'll put this link in the video description. Now, the next thing that we want to do to create our database, we are going to follow the same principle that we are following in this project. We will create a project that will be looking after all the data objects. So we'll call this project as data service, similar to what we did with the logging. We did not implement anything inside our main project. We created a separate class library and then we consumed it in our main project. So let's go ahead and create our data service projects. Go ahead, right click, add new project. Now what you have to do is go into web and console, select library, class library. Make sure that the class library is .NET Core. Click next. Let's name this project as data service. For naming conventions, as I've always mentioned, you can name your projects, your files or folders, whatever you like. You don't have to follow the naming convention that I do. So then for browse, let's browse, go to the desktop. Make sure you are not creating the project inside your main project. Instead, you want to create the project in the folder which contains all your projects. So here I'm going to select the cms_core_ng folder and then click open. Now I'm going to click create. So as you can see that the project is now created. To make sure that you have not created the project inside your main project, go ahead and open your main project and just see that there is no folder with the same name data service created inside your main project. If you see that, go ahead, delete it and make sure you create the project outside your main project folder. So now I just don't need this class one class that is created by default. So I'll go ahead and delete it. Now the next thing I want to do is go ahead and build my application to make sure that there are no errors. So the build was successful, and now let's go ahead and create the required classes that we need for building our database. For the classes in the data service project, we would need 3 classes. Let's go ahead and create them. Once they're created, I'll explain to you why we need those classes. First, let's create a class called as application DB context. Then let's create another class. We'll call this class as data protection keys context. Data protection keys context. So I hit new. And then we need another class. Let's add this class and call this as DB context initializer. So we have created three classes: application DB context, data protection context, data protection keys context, and DB initializer context. So now the next thing that we want to do here is install certain NuGet packages so that we can get started with implementing membership in our application. So we would need to install the following packages. First, Microsoft ASP.NET Core Data Protection Entity Framework Core. So let's go to our project, right click and add those NuGet packages. So let's search for this package, which is data protection. As the first in search, I'll select it and then add the package. Make sure you choose the latest stable version. You might see a preview version, but in our project we're using the stable version, and the stable version at this point is 3.1.5. So I'll add this package. Once again, I have got certain license agreement acceptance, so I have to accept it before I install this package. So the package was successfully installed. Let's install the second package, which is identity.EntityFrameworkCore. So let's select that, stable, add. Microsoft Entity Framework Core design. And finally, Microsoft Entity Framework Core tools. So now we have installed all the required packages for building our data service project. I will provide the information or the names of these packages in the video description so you can search them easily on NuGet. So the next thing that we would want to add is a model class that will hold all the extended properties of our application user. We have already installed the package called as Microsoft ASP.NET Core Entity Framework Core. This package comes built in with certain classes to implement membership in your application. So if you want to manage users, we can create classes or we can create database tables with all information, that is user roles, user passwords, and so on. But we also need to extend this class if we want to add some additional properties. For example, I want to add the user's middle name, and there might not be a middle name property in the default ASP.NET Core Identity class. So, but I need to use the middle name property in my application. So how do I do that? For that, I would need to extend this class and add some additional properties. So let's go ahead and create our custom model class for application user so we can extend that properties. Now to extend the properties and create the model class, I'm not going to create it in the data service. Once again, I'm going to have a separate project that will manage all the model classes in my entire project. So let's go ahead, right click, add a new project. Go to Web and Console, Library, Class Library. Make sure you select .NET Core Class Library. Hit Next. We'll name this project as Model Service. Now let's browse to our project. Make sure that you are not inside the project folder, which is basically your main project. You can go back to the desktop or where the main project lies and then select the folder that contains all your projects. So once again, select the folder that contains all your projects, not the folder which contains your main project. So I'm going to select the folder and then click open. And now I'm going to create this project inside that folder. Now I'll delete this default class that is created, and I will now add a new class. I will call this class as application user and then create it. So since we want to extend the properties of the existing Entity Framework Core identity package, I would also need to add that package here in this project since I don't have access to that package here. While I'm adding the package from NuGet package manager, I need to make sure that I install the same version that I have installed here in this project to have any version conflicts. So here in the Entity Framework Core package that I've installed in data service, I want to make sure that I install the same version, which is 3.1.5. So let's right click here, add, manage NuGet packages, then search for the package which is so let's search for this package, which is ASP.NET Core Identity Entity Framework Core. .NET Core, and keep searching that identity. So that's the package. I'll select the same version, which is 3.1.5, and then add the package. Accept. So the package is installed, and now I should see it here. Now what I can do, go back to the application user class and extend this class from identity user. And now I'll add the missing reference to Microsoft ASP.NET Core Identity. Since I've added the package, I can add this using statement now. Here I don't need the constructor for this class, so I'll delete it. And here inside this class, I will add all the additional properties that I need related to my application user, which are not available in the default library of Entity Framework Core. So I have added the class over here, all the properties inside the class. I might also need to add one more class which will hold all the user addresses. So in this application, the user can have a billing address and a shipping address. So I need to make sure that I create a separate table in my database that will store all this information related to shipping and billing address. So I will create a separate address table. So for that, I would need to create a class that can hold all the properties related to the address table. So here let's add another class. Call this class as address model, hit new. We don't need the constructor. So here I have added all the required properties that are needed in the address model class. I've added the address ID, which is the primary key. So I have decorated it with the key attribute of data annotations. So once you add the key attribute, please go ahead and add the using system.componentModel.data annotation reference, and also add the data annotations.schema reference, since we are going to reference or specify what is the foreign key for this table, and then we will decorate the foreign key with the foreign key attribute. So now we have all these properties here, out of which only one property, which is the country name, is required, because while registering the users, we will only need the name of the country from where the user is registering. So this should be it for the address model. So we have created a reference or relation between the two tables using the Entity Framework Core method here by specifying a virtual object to the application user class or the application user table. As I mentioned earlier at the very beginning, that if you need more information on how to use Entity Framework Core and how to learn the relation between these two tables, how to manage them, you can go ahead and read the official documentation from Entity Framework Core provided by Microsoft. Now here, and we have created the address model class, and now let's go back to the application user class and let's add some relation or reference to that class in this application user class. So the way we will add reference is by creating a object of type iCollections. So iCollections, let's add the missing reference using system.collection.generic, and here we are passing the address model. So the user address is basically a collection of all user addresses, which is the address model. So user can have multiple user addresses and an address can have one user. So it's one to many and many to one relation here. So that should be it for this class and for the address model class. Now I can click save and just go back to our application DB context class, and here now in the application DB context class I need to specify that while creating the database, also create the additional classes and implement the membership system that is required in our application. So for that I have to extend this application DB class from identity DB context and then specify the application user class, which will contain all the additional or extended properties. Here I need to first add the missing references to ASP.NET Core Identity Entity Framework Core and missing reference to the application user. Now the application user is inside model service. So let's go ahead, right click on dependencies, add reference, and add reference to the model service. Let's also add reference to the logging service so that in case if we need to print any logs, we can print them using the logging service. So let's click OK. And now let's reference this class using application user. So using model service. So now we can see the reference. After a few seconds, we can add this model service reference and we should not see any errors. Now when we are inheriting from the identity DB context class, we need to make sure we pass the options or database context option to the base constructor. So to do that, what we are going to do is DB context options class. We will use the DB context option class, specify the application DB context and specify the options object property. So using the options object here, we are going to pass it to the base constructor. Let's add the missing reference. It should be DB context options. So let's add the missing reference using Microsoft Entity Framework Core. So here we have added the missing reference. Now we don't have any error. So this options will be passed to the base constructor, and while creating the database, it will look for all these options that we are passing. Now the next thing that we want to do is create certain roles. So while creating the database, we want to make sure that certain user roles are created before creating or before loading the application. So we would just create two roles. One is the administrator role and one is the customer roles. If there are any other roles that we need to add, we will add them using our application UI that we will build. But while loading the application for the first time, we need to make sure that we have at least two roles in our application. One is the administrator role and one is the customer role. So let's create these default roles. So to create the default roles, we are going to override the onModel creating method of Entity Framework. And now what we want to do is using the builder object, we will specify the properties. So let's add the missing reference to ASP.NET Core identity. Now in the identity role table, we are going to make sure that we add 2 roles. So identity role is already part of the ASP.NET Core identity. As I mentioned earlier, it comes with some default classes. Now what we are doing is we are just adding some data in that table. What data? It's just an administrator and customer default role. Also, we would need to create certain DB sets. So for now, we just have 2 model classes over here, one for our addresses and one for the application user. So let's go ahead and create those 2 DB sets. So I have created these 2 DB sets, one for application user and one for address model. So I have used the plural naming convention. And here we can use these DB sets when we want to perform any CRUD operation on our database. That is, we need to get any data, we need to add any data, we need to delete or update any data. We can use these DB sets to perform those operations. We don't need to run any SQL query. Instead, we can just use link queries to run on these DB sets, and then we can perform the required operations. So this should be it for this class. I can go ahead and save this. Now let's go back to the data protection keys context class, and let's try to add the required options here in this class. But we will do that in the next video tutorial. So the next video tutorial will be the continuation of creating database service or creating the data service. Please like and subscribe our channel Tech Howdy. If you have any questions, use the comment section.